Hi, I'm Mikey. Thank you for joining me. Today I'd like to talk to you about this pretty little green dress that I made using a sewing pattern called the Daisy Dress by Oh Me, Oh My Sewing. I'll leave all of the links down below so that you can see where I got the pattern from and you can get your copy and sew along with me. I have my printed pattern. This is the version that I'm going to be sewing today, so this is the snapback version. So let's get everything ready for sewing. Looking at the pattern, the first thing it tells me is that I need to lay my pattern pieces out, pop them on top of my fabric and cut out all of the pieces along the edges. And we are of course going to be transferring all of the markings and notches as well. So for this particular pattern I need the front skirt and I also need the back skirt. I need a front bodice piece along with a front bodice lining piece, a back bodice and a back bodice lining piece, and the final piece that I need for this pattern is the placket interfacing piece. So I'm going to grab my fabric, cut all of these pieces out and then get them ready to sew. Here's the lovely green fabric that I chose for my main fabric or my self fabric, and the first piece that I'm going to cut out is the front skirt. Because the front skirt's a little bit wider, I have decided that I'm just going to cut it on the center of the fabric. So I'm just going to pin that in place and then I'm going to carefully cut around the edge of that piece. Now this is a rectangular piece, so I could probably just mark it on the fabric as well and just use a ruler. I do like to use my pattern pieces and my ruler at the same time so that I can make sure I get a nice, accurate, even cut. When you're using a quilting ruler and a rotary cutter like this, sometimes you might need to move a pin or two out of the way, but there is my front skirt piece. I'm just going to do exactly the same with the back skirt piece. So you can see again, I'm just using that quilting ruler there to cut it out. And once I'm done, moving on to the bodice. So this is actually the back bodice piece. And I decided to cut it on the fold so that I could use a smaller amount of fabric with a little bit less waste. And then I'm just going to cut it down the middle because that is a straight edge down the center of that bodice anyway. So out come the pins, off goes the pattern piece, and you can see all I did was I just carefully sliced that down the middle, and that's my back bodice piece done. So here's my front and my back bodice, my front and my back skirt. Here are my lining pieces as well that I've cut out. And finally, here is my placket interfacing. So this is just cut from medium weight fusible interfacing. Okay, ready to start now. So looking at the pattern, it tells us that we're going to iron the interfacing pieces to the center back of the snapback bodice. So I'm going to do exactly that. First of all, I'm going to line those pieces up nicely and you'll see that they are just a tiny bit smaller than the top and bottom of the back piece. So that just makes sure that you don't overlap. And all I did here was I held my steam iron over the top on the appropriate setting for the fabric. Then, of course, we're going to take our fabric pen and transfer all of the markings over onto the self fabric and the lining fabric as well. So I've got my markings for where my snaps are going to go, and I've also got all of the notches on the pattern as well. So I'm going to transfer each of those now. So you can see here I'm just doing this on one side of the self fabric, and then I'm going to flip it over and do the other side as well. So as I said, don't forget those notches, they are really important for placement. Alright, so I'm just going to quickly pop some on the other side as well, not forgetting the notch at the bottom, and there we're all done. Okay, next up, the pattern tells me to lay out my front and back bodice pieces right sides together because we're going to sew the shoulder seams. And remember, whatever you do for the self fabric, you're also going to do for the lining fabric as well. So you can see I'm just laying those out, matching up the shoulder seams, and I'm going to pop a couple of pins on there, and then we're going to take it over to the sewing machine and sew right across these two seams. There's my pins, and off we go. So here we're at the sewing machine. All I'm going to do is just a simple straight seam right across the top with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at the the start and the end of that seam. Here's what it looks like. And let's do the other side as well while we're here. So that's the self fabric. As I said, everything that we do for the self fabric, we're also going to do for the lining fabric. So I'm going to take out my bodice front and bodice back in the lining fabric and do exactly the same. So here's the front, here's the back going on top. Couple of pins, and we'll take it over to the sewing machine and sew those seams as well. Exactly the same stitch length, same back stitch, everything. And that is my lining stitched together at the shoulder seams. The next thing I like to do is iron those seams open and flat, because we are now going to join these two pieces together. So on both the self and the lining, I've flattened out those seams. So I'm laying my self fabric right side facing up, and I'm going to lay my lining fabric right side facing down, so they are right sides together. Okay, match them up as best you can, and make sure those shoulder seams match up really well as well. So what I'm going to do is sew all the way up the back, around that neckline, making sure to pivot at each of the corners, and down the other side of the back. And then I'm also going to sew all the way around each of the armhole edges, and you'll notice I'm not doing anything with the side seams just yet. So I am going to put lots of clips on. I like to have lots of clips in place just to make sure nothing moves around while I'm sewing it in place. And some in the armholes as well, making sure to pin those curves. Cracking. So here we are at the sewing machine again. This time, this is with a slightly smaller seam allowance. This is a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So the first thing I'm doing is the back and the neckline, and you can see when I get to each of those corners, I just leave the needle down and pivot the work in place. Take out the clips as you get to them and work all your way around that neckline. Okay, once you've got to the edge of the neckline, we're just going to pivot and sew all the way down the back, right to the bottom, and backstitch at the end. So here's my nice neat seam there. Now you may notice that my self fabric is slightly bigger than my lining fabric. So what I chose to do here was I did my 1/4 inch away from the edge of the lining fabric rather than the self fabric to make sure that everything was joined together. Here I am stitching the armholes, and you can see that I'm using both hands to manipulate the fabric. I'm not pulling it straight and I'm not pulling it tight. I'm making sure that it stays a nice gentle curve going around that armhole. Backstitch at the end. And you can see that I've matched those seams up nicely. I'm just going to do exactly the same on the other side, and again using both hands to manipulate the fabric, making sure that I don't pull it tight and I don't pull it straight, because I want the stitches to lay nice and flat when I turn this through. Next up, the pattern tells us to make some notches, so we're going to notch around the armholes and the neckline, and we're going to cut off any sharp corners as well. So here on this first one, I'll go quite slowly so you can see exactly what I'm doing. I'm just snipping in where the edge is curved, and I'm going almost up to my stitch line but not quite touching it. Lots of nice little notches in there, and then if I do pull this tight, you can see where the notches are. So there are quite a lot of them that I've cut in there. I'm going to do exactly the same on the other one, go through this one a little bit faster. And then around the neckline, I'm going to cut off those sharp corners, and then in each of the little points where I pivoted, I'm going to cut again right up to my stitch line without cutting through my stitches. Here's that last one. The pattern now wants us to turn everything right side out, so we're going to pull the front through the back at the shoulder. And if you're having trouble with any of the points, you'll see in a second I used a chopstick. The pattern suggests that you can use a blunt pencil or a knitting needle, something like that, to gently push those corners through. I have sped this up because this is quite the process. For the smaller sizes, this is maybe a little bit less easy. The bigger you go with this, the bigger the gap you've got in the shoulder seam, so the easier it is to turn through. But you can see it's all coming through nicely. And here is the other back piece coming through. So I've pulled everything through that one shoulder seam. Okay, here's that chopstick. You can see I'm getting ready to push out those little corners. So all I'm going to do is, once I've turned it through, I'm just going to push it right up into the corner, roll the fabric ever so slightly to make sure that nothing's twisted in there and to make sure that the seam is laying nice and flat. And you can see actually it does give me quite a nice sharp corner. Exactly the same for the other side now. Just poke that chopstick up in there. If you have a point turning tool or anything like that, you can use that as well. And at this point, I like to give it all a good press. So I've manipulated and rolled my seams to make sure that they are nice and flat. And the first thing that I'm ironing is the very back seams. Then I'm going to give those armholes a press as well. Just making sure that all that fabric is laying nice and flat. And lastly, I'm going to do the shoulders as well. So you'll remember that we ironed those seams flat inside. And that'll help them sit nice and flat once we get to this stage. Once we're here, the pattern gives us two different options for sewing together the side seams. You could of course just sew them together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance with right sides together, but if you want to hide those seams, if you want to have some invisible seams, you can separate out the self fabric from the lining fabric, sew the lining to the lining and the self to the self, and then push that seam allowance toward the back of the garment. So that's what I've done here. I've opened them up and you can see that I have the lining fabric together with the lining fabric, the self fabric together with the self fabric. I'm just going to pop in a couple of clips and you'll see that my seam allowance is pointing toward my lining. So that's that side all clipped and ready to go. I'm just going to do exactly the same thing for the other side. So a clip in the middle with the seam allowance facing the lining fabric, and another clip on the edge just to keep everything nice and neat, and let's pop it over to the sewing machine. Once we're at the machine, this is just a standard 1/2 inch seam allowance, and again I'm just making sure that that seam allowance is pointing toward my lining fabric. Once it's done, you can see those seam allowances match up nicely, and when I open it out you can see we've got a nice invisible seam and you can't see it from the front or the back. Now it's time to open it up, push those seam allowances toward the back of the garment, and we're going to give it a good press, and then we're going to top stitch. So we're going to top stitch up the side seams and all the way around the armhole. We're going to do that on both sides, and then we're going to top stitch up the back seam right along the neckline and then down the other back seam as well. So I've started out with the side seam, and I don't know if you noticed there, but rather than using a back stitch, my machine has what's called a reinforcement stitch. So if you've got one of those, this is a great place to use it. It makes it less visible, and it means you're not going to have a back stitch at the beginning and the end of your seam. The top stitch, just like any other, is quite close to the edge of the fabric, and I have elongated my stitch length to make it 3mm. And again, I'm just going to end that seam with the reinforcement stitch rather than the top stitch. So this does all the stitches in the same place, so that it means you don't have that back stitch at the end. And you can see my top stitching has elongated stitches and is very close to the edge of the fabric. I'm going to do the same now for the back and the neckline. So I've just worked my way up the back of the garment, leave the needle down, pivot the work in place, and all the way around that neck, and every time I get to one of those corners I'm going to do exactly the same thing, just pivoting as I go. And lastly, all the way down the back, finishing off with that reinforcement stitch, and here is what my top stitching looks like. Okay, we're back over at the cutting mat. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to close the back of the bodice. The pattern here says that we need to overlap the back bodice pieces so that the notches match, and then we're going to sew them in place 3/8 of an inch from the edge. So that's just a small stitch at the bottom of the back bodice. I am using a back stitch here, both at the beginning and the end of the seam. This seam is going to be hidden in the skirt waistband anyway. And the next thing that the pattern has us do is apply the snaps to the dots on the snapback bodice. So once you've sewn it all together, you should just be left with your dots at the back and they should match up. And you can see here I was auditioning different colours to see which colour snaps I wanted to use. I went with this darker purple because I felt like it brought out the colours in the fabric a little bit more. I'll show you this first one. So I've put the snap through and I've put the fastener on the other side, and I'm just using the tool that comes with it to flatten the inside of the snap. So that's what it should look like on the inside. I'll just do the other side of that snap as well, just to show you what it'll look like. Remember to get these the right way around as well. Off camera, I'm just going to pop on all of the other snaps as well. So this is what the back of the snapback bodice looks like once you've got your snaps in place. The next thing the pattern has us do is sew the side seams of the skirt. Now what I like to do personally before I sew the side seams is to put on the markings for the hem. So later on the pattern will ask us to make a mark on the fabric 1/2 inch from the edge, and then another mark 1.5 inches from the edge. So that's what I'm doing here on the skirt front and the skirt back. I like to do this now so that I'm not having to navigate with any seams or anything like that. And then I'm going to do exactly as the pattern says, and I'm going to join the side seams and sew that with a 1/2 inch seam allowance down both sides. So again, this is just a nice straight stitch, just with a normal stitch length of 2.5 millimeters, with a back stitch at the beginning and the end. I'm going to do that on both sides. And then you need to finish your seam. So it's entirely up to you how you finish your seam. You might want to do an overcast stitch, use your overlocker. I decided I was going to do a flat fell seam. So all I've done is I finger pressed the seam open, and I'm going to trim off around about half of one side of the seam allowance. Then I'm going to give it all just a quick gentle press to one side to make sure that the longer part of the seam allowance is covering the shorter part. And then I'll fold the longer part over the shorter part, making sure that the raw edge touches my stitch line. Give that a really good press, and we're going to do that for both sides. Okay, there's one. I'm going to do exactly the same for the other side. So again, you can see I'm using just the same technique. And once you've pressed it, if you do find that there are any areas that aren't quite folded in enough, just give them a little push and another little press. And then all we're going to do is stitch down that edge. So your seam allowance here is going to depend on the way that you've cut and folded the fabric. Mine ends up being around about 1/4 inch. Again, this stitching is going to be visible from the outside, so I have elongated my stitch length to around about 3 millimeters. But it's just a nice straight stitch all the way down, and I am going to use the back stitch at the beginning and the end because both of those ends are going to be hidden in the waistband and the hem. Just coming up to the end of the stitch now, and you can see this is what it looks like from the outside, so it's a nice neat seam. This is what it looks like from the inside, so you can see that there are no raw edges visible. Okay, next it's time to start gathering the skirt. So the pattern has us set the machine to the longest stitch length and stitch 3/8 inch from the top of the skirt on both the skirt front and the skirt back. Make sure you leave those tails a reasonable length so that you can gather the skirt in later on. If your machine's got a thread cutting function, maybe don't use that here, so just lift your presser foot up, pull it out as you normally would, and snip your threads off. As I said, we're going to do that for both the front skirt and the back skirt, so I've sped this one up a little bit. And now it's time to join together the skirt and the bodice. And to do that, we need to make sure everything is turned the right way and lined up. So the pattern asks us to turn the bodice the right side out and the skirt inside out. and then match up all the notches. So you can see that's what I'm doing here. My skirt is now inside out. I'm just going to make sure I've got the front and back the right way around, and you can see I'm going to match those notches up. So just open up the skirt and pop the bodice inside. Then we need to pin everything in place. So we're going to pin the front notches together and the back notches together, and we're also going to pin the side seams. I'm using wonder clips, but you can use clips or pins, whichever way you prefer to pin everything together. So I pinned my 4 quadrants, and now I'm going to start to gather. So to gather, I'm just going to use one of those long threads that I left after stitching the long stitch length. And the key here is to be consistent with which one you use. So don't pull the top on and then pull the bottom one, because you will break your thread doing it that way. Go nice and slowly, there's no rush for this bit. So you can see I'm just pulling through small amounts of the thread and then just pulling it up together. And once the skirt section and the bodice section are the same length, I'm just going to pop in another clip or another pin. So I will end up with 8 clips around the circumference of the waist as well. Okay, here you can see I'm happy with that, so I'm popping that clip just in the middle of the other 2. And I've sped this up a little bit just to get through it, but it's the same principle for the other 3 quarters of the skirt as well, so just gathering to make sure everything is the same width. There we go, everything's gathered nicely, so we're going to take this over to the sewing machine. You can see that the way that I'm sewing this is I have the gathered section facing down onto the feed dogs. So what that's going to do is it's going to make the feed dogs help the gathered fabric go through at the same speed as the straight fabric, meaning that you avoid any wrinkles or puckers in that nice straight fabric of the bodice. So I'm just going to continue all the way around with that nice straight stitch, keeping my seam allowance nice and even, and then finish off with a back stitch, as you can see here. Here's what it looks like from the outside, so you can see that I've got no wrinkles in there, no puckers, and it's nice and smooth. Okay, so once everything's joined up, it's time to put on the finishing touches, the first one being the hem. So you'll remember that the pattern asked us to draw lines 1/2 inch and 1.5 inches away from the bottom of the skirt. I did those before I stitched them together, but if you didn't, now's the time to put those on. And we're going to use those lines to fold up the hem. So first of all, I'm folding up the 1/2 inch line, just folding straight up to that line and giving it a nice steam press to give me a nice crisp, clean fold. Then once I've got all the way around, I'm just going to do exactly the same again with the second line, giving it a good steam press to give me a nice clean finish ready for sewing. So over at the sewing machine, I'm just going to stitch this all the way around with a single line of nice straight stitching. You can elongate your stitches here if you want to, it's not necessary. Sometimes it looks nicer with longer stitches. You can also do a second line of stitches parallel to the first line. Use a twin needle, use a cover stitch machine if you have one, but really all you actually need is one single line of stitching, and this is what it looks like from the outside and the inside. The last thing I did was I overlocked that seam. If you don't have an overlocker, absolutely not a problem. You can use an overcasting stitch on your sewing machine. There are lots of different ways that you can finish this seam. And here's what that finished seam looks like. And the last thing that I'm going to do is thread in the end of my overlock tail. So I've just threaded a hand sewing needle underneath the edge loops of the overlock stitch, and I'm going to snip off the edges of that thread just to make sure they're all nice and even. Thread those into the needle, There we go, they're threaded through the needle. So once I'm happy with that, I'm going to pull the needle through and pull all of those threads underneath the loops made by the overlocker. Snip it off, and that's my overlocker thread secured. Finally, this is what the dress looks like from the front. And here it is from the back. And that's it. That's the daisy dress from start to finish. You've seen all of the techniques that I used to make mine, so hopefully you can sew along and make one of your own. If you'd like to see more of my sewing makes, you can find me over on Instagram, links down below, and you can also find below a link to my Minerva page where you can see all of the patterns and fabrics that I'm in love with, and you can read in a little bit more detail all about the things that I've been sewing. There's some other useful information down in the description as well, like the fabric that I used to make this sweatshirt, for example, and of course all of the links to everything that we've seen in today's video. Thank you for watching, hopefully I'll see you again soon.